Hello everybody, my name's Dr. Jim Rogers and I'm absolutely delighted to be working with you at Castle School. I'm sorry you couldn't make the session on Friday, or I'm really pleased if you did make the session and you're also looking at this recording. This is just a short recording summarising the key messages, the key points from the session that I will be delivering on Friday morning this week. So you can tell I'm recording this before Friday's session. It's a good little rehearsal for me as well. I'll just let you read the cartoon. Actually, I'm a big fan of Calvin and Hobbes, and I particularly like this little cartoon. It's reminding me of my children who are currently in their Zoom lessons as I record this. Just in terms of today's session, I've been asked to talk to you just to kind of revisit pedagogical principles and learning theory and consider implications for practice. But I also want to focus on some of the positive legacy from what has been a really challenging period, obviously over the last 12 months. So there's going to be three parts. Part one is going to be about the wider educational context. Then I'm going to just explore briefly the importance of relationships and rapport. And then we're going to revisit that learning theory and then talk about pedagogical principles. So by all means, if you need to have a break as you're watching this, stop at each section and take a breather. I'm going to try and record it in one hit, so hopefully I can do this. And I just want to say as well, it is absolutely Baltic where I am recording this at the minute. I've got my jumper on. I'm going to try not to shiver too much, but it's pretty cold outside. So who am I to talk to you? Well, my name, as I said, is Dr. Jim Rogers. I work in the Southwest predominantly. I also work internationally. Everything to do with education. I've been a teacher, school leader, an academic at Exeter University. I've supported the Teaching School Council over the last 5 years on sort of regional school improvement and strategy. But my sort of the core business of what I really enjoy doing is designing and delivering professional learning programs. I'm working with your RQTs, your recently qualified teachers at Castle, and I also work to support Courtfield School as well, along with a whole host of other projects that I deliver regionally and nationally. I host a little podcast which I'll make mention of a bit later today with a couple of guests that I've had. I'm no professional, but I've been doing it to sort of support the region over the last 12 months, and I really enjoy it. It gives me a great opportunity to speak to some brilliant people, and some of your colleagues will be part of this podcast in the next few weeks, I hope. So one of the things that I've been doing, or I will be doing like this Friday morning, is just talking about the wider educational context. I think it's really important to kind of contextualize and ground ourselves in terms of where we are in our thinking. And you may have come across some of the international educational measures before. Probably the most famous is PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment. And PISA looks at the OECD countries and looks at the sort of relative educational outputs for those countries. So one of the things that I'll do on Friday is I'll ask members of staff where they think we are in terms of our kind of performance against those other OECD countries, whether we're top third, middle third, or bottom third. And the results are on the screen, ordered in terms of reading outcomes, but there's also mathematics and science outcomes as well. And you can see that we are just there, look, right down in the bottom left-hand corner. But when we take that in the context of all 96 countries, we're actually 14th. We're in the top, just about the top quarter there for reading, and we follow a similar sort of order for maths and science. So we're doing really well. The East Asian countries are right at the top and have been for a while there. If we look at a couple of other measures, there's TIMSS and PEARLS. They record educational achievement for science and mathematics from a broader range of 64 countries. I say a broader range, a different mix of countries. And you'll see there that we are just there, look, 13th out of 64 countries for mathematics in 8th grade, which is the end of year 9. And similarly, For science, at the same level, at the same end of year 9, we're 14th from 64 countries, and we've been around about the same point now for a number of years. The PISA and Pearls and Tims are going to get updated again soon, so it's going to be interesting to see what the impact of the pandemic has been. But I think that we're doing a really good job. So I just wanted to say this in the sort of broader context of where we are. We quite often hear our government ministers talking about aspiring to be the top achievers there, and they quite often point to those East Asian countries. But actually, if you take a step back, we do particularly well, and we have been for a long time now. So just a bit of a positive message there. This is a bit of a rhetorical question, really, and it's not a task that I'm going to do on Friday morning, but it's something that I'm going to ask you to think about perhaps during half term, or if you're a middle leader working with your teams, it could be an activity that you do with your teams as well. And it's just to take stock, just to take a moment to think about how much you've learned as an individual, and also how much you think your teams have developed over the last 12 months, and your students as well. And what I want to do today is I want to kind of pick out perhaps some of the positive legacy from the last 12 months. I'm not going to gloss over the fact that it's been a really challenging period, and it continues to be. But from my perspective, I think there are a number of really important things that we can build on over the last 12 months. So one of the things that I'm going to ask your colleagues to do on Friday morning is to give me a kind of sense of where they think they are in terms of positive aspects of remote delivery, whether you think learning is taking place or not for the majority of students, whether you think students are developing and learning transferable skills, and whether we think that pedagogical principles can be applied to remote learning. So it's going to be interesting to see what your staff say in terms of their sort of sense of confidence there. And some of these questions are taken from some of the sort of rhetoric that I'm hearing in the media, which has been quite negative about the impact of the pandemic on teaching. And I actually think there are a number of real positives. And it was interesting on the BBC Today programme recently, there was a member of staff in a North Devon school that called in to sort of counter some of the rhetoric that's been coming from the BBC about education. And I think it's important that we kind of challenge back a little bit as well. We are concerned about vulnerable learners. We are concerned about some of our disadvantaged pupils. And you will know who's engaging with your online lessons and who aren't. But I think for the majority, and particularly those that are engaged, there is positive legacy. So some of the things that I've picked out over the last few months is that I think children are developing their metacognitive skills. Some of those students are, particularly in terms of managing their own learning, managing their day, managing what they've got to do in terms of their own learning. That's obviously supported by your teaching and your feedback, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. I think there are considerable transferable skills, particularly in the use of technology to both learn, to collaborate, and to sort of communicate with each other as well. You will see a huge development of the use of Zoom and Teams and so on, and children are a part of that as well. So I think those transferable skills are going to be really, really important, and perhaps wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. And interestingly, and this is sort of anecdotal really, I think there are a number of students that struggle a little bit in school. They're actually doing better working from home. They're definitely not a majority, but I think some are finding their voice from working at home and working through their kind of Teams or Zoom sort of concept. And I think the same applies for your teachers. Teachers are using technology in a way that we haven't done before to teach and to collaborate for their own professional development. I think we're given an opportunity to get a slightly different perspective on learning and assessment and our curriculum offer through this last 12 months. And I think that we've become far more aware of learners' needs socially, emotionally and academically. It certainly furthered my own thinking in terms of the role of schools and seeing the impact on my own children. I should have mentioned that earlier actually. I'm a father of two fantastic girls, one in year 10 and one in year 8, and I've seen the impact of the pandemic on them negatively, and that continues to be a challenge. But I've also seen how much they miss school, how much they're missing their friends, and that's such an important part of their development and growing up. So it's given me a kind of different perspective on education, and I suspect it has done for you as well. So just in terms of key messages, very simply, we do well internationally. We're well regarded internationally in terms of our education system. And for the last 12 months, although it's been very challenging, I think there is some positive legacy, some things that we will keep as we go back, hopefully, towards a kind of more normal practice. So what I'd like to do now, this would be a good place to stop and take a breath and pause. I'm going to continue recording, and what I'd like to do now is just talk about learning theory in the context of relationships and rapport. I've been doing a lot of work on this over the last 12 months and actually before then as well, but it's kind of really come to the fore in terms of importance over the last 12 months. And I work a lot with a group in Denmark called the Nordic Schools, which I'll talk about in a second. But I just want to talk about the conditions for learning, because I think this is really, really important. So if we consider this as a kind of a hierarchy, learning comes at the top. So if we want to reach learning, we obviously apply pedagogical principles. So we apply a kind of a pedagogical approach to our teaching, which is the right way of going about it. But in order for that to work, I argue that students need to be in a kind of emotional position. There needs to be a kind of emotional readiness to learn. Okay, so that emotional readiness kind of allows students to be receptive to learning, and that comes from your relationships and rapport with your students, and it comes from high levels of trust. So for me, if we think about this in a kind of a hierarchy, to reach that point of learning, all of those other conditions and sort of sequences need to take place prior to that. That creates the conditions for learning, and that's what you're responsible for as a teacher or an educational professional. I'm going to go into this in a little bit more depth, and I'm going to introduce to you something called the polyvagal theory. It looks very complicated, but I just want you to concentrate on the green, the yellow and the red, and I'm going to talk through this now. So the vagal nervous system is what connects our organs to our brain and to our senses. Okay, and it's what it's what we use to interact with the world around us. It's actually what we use to survive as well. So some of it is linked to a kind of more primitive functions that we have of fight and flight and survival. The key messages for you are this. In order for us to be receptive for learning, whether we're a child or an adult, we need to be in the green phase. And the green phase is about being calm, about being settled, about being grounded. And when we're in that kind of physiological state, we can engage in the world around us. We can be curious, open to learning. We can interact with other people as well. So that's what you're trying to create in your classrooms, and that's what we're trying to create when we're teaching remotely as well, although we have less input on that. The key thing is this, that when there's a sense of danger, and anybody, when there's a sense of danger, we start sort of charging our body. There's a kind of physiological response to take some sort of action. It could be to fight, it could be to run, or it could be to find food or whatever it may be. But we enter into our kind of sympathetic nervous system response, and that's the yellow phase. As soon as we're in that yellow phase, we are not receptive to learning, nor are we receptive to learning when we're in the red phase, which is at a kind of extreme level, which is where we perceive there's a threat to life. Now, why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because if we are to define trauma can be about that kind of long-term insecurity about the world around us, not being really too sure what's going on, a kind of low-level sense of threat. And what I've noticed, and I've noticed this in my own children as well, is that the children are a little bit more kind of emotionally charged, particularly when there's big changes. And we've seen that last year when we were first working from home, then we were back in school, and now we're working from home again for some children. those big changes can kind of emotionally charge children. Plus, there's a huge amount of uncertainty out there. Plus, there's going to be impact on families and parents as well. So the key thing is that unless students are in that green phase, they're unlikely to be receptive to learning, but we can have an impact on that. So the good news is that students aren't kind of defined by those states. We can create the conditions to bring students out of the red phase, out of the yellow phase, into the green phase through our work with them, through relationships. There are rapport with students, high levels of trust and security, and clear communication. So that's the good news, that's the positive. Now, I mentioned earlier that I work with some Danish colleagues called the Nordic Schools. The Nordic Schools look at what's successful in the 4 Nordic countries, which is Finland, Sweden, Denmark and Norway. And they look at what are the effective approaches in those countries in terms of teaching, and they do well in international educational outcomes as well. And they've worked on something called the Nordic teaching model, which I've presented here. The recently qualified teachers that I work with in Castle School have already seen this. And what we're particularly interested in is that top left-hand quarter, okay, the social competences. Now, what I really like about this is a kind of an antidote for the teaching standards. This is all of the soft skills that are required to be a successful teacher alongside the prescriptive teaching standards. So the top left-hand corner there, the corner, it's a circle, but the top left-hand quartile is the social competencies, which is about relationships with students in the class, relationships with individual students, and then developing and strengthening those relationships. And the reason I've presented it here for you today is that I know, and I've been working with the Nordic Schools on this, we've created a little online course. So if I'll provide the links for these people, but you can click onto the Nordic Schools website, get an idea of the work that they do, and then you can take part in a little online course. If you're an RQT and you're part of my program, you're not allowed to do it yet because it might form your inquiry later this year. But it's a really neat way of beginning to define those kind of social and emotional competencies that I think are going to be really, really important now and as we come back into receiving students back into the classroom. So just to recap on that section of the presentation, the key messages are as follows. Students need to be in an emotional and a physiological state of readiness to learn. We can influence that through effective social and emotional approaches, particularly through relationships and rapport. This is something we can learn, so it's not all about kind of personality and intuition. So we can learn that through following Nordic Schools program, for example. And I think we need to be mindful of that now and as students return to classrooms. And just so that you know, on Friday morning, we'll give teachers an opportunity just to reflect on how they've gone about developing those kind of relationships and rapport with their students as we've been working remotely. Examples might be using the reward system, phone calls home, phone calls to your tutor group, the use of that pastoral system to support students. All of those things are developing that kind of connection between parents, families, students and school. So again, it's a good point to have a quick pause and a reflection before I start the last bit of the presentation, and that's going to be about learning theory and the pedagogical principles. Now this is going to be the key focus for Friday morning. So what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to consider what I'm going to present to you next through 2 lenses really. One is in terms of your practice now, and one is in terms of your practice going forward, so as students come back into the classroom. So everything that I talk about now, I want you to look at through those 2 lenses. And what I'm going to do is revisit some learning theory. I'm going to talk about pedagogical principles that kind of are informed by that learning theory. And then we're going to look at some of the kind of strategies that we can use, both in terms of our remote teaching and to keep you focused on that as you come back into school. So let's just start with some definitions. Cognitive or learning theory. When we talk about learning, we're talking about long-term retention of knowledge in a way that we can transfer and withdraw those in different sort of contexts, so we can apply those in different contexts. So it's about long-term memory, and it's about applying that learning into different contexts. Cognition is quite simply just the mental process that we go through in terms of thinking and knowing and learning. And I've included the term metacognition. Schools love metacognition. Metacognition is when students or we are self-regulating our learning, so we're kind of managing our own process of learning. And as I said earlier, I think that's something that we can capitalize on now. As you might have realized so far, I like the big picture stuff, so I just want to talk about some of the context. Part of this context at the minute is the Ofsted inspection framework. This gentleman here is Professor Daniel Mears. Daniel was a guest of mine last year on my podcast, and he's head of research for Ofsted and a professor in educational research at Southampton University. So Daniel's been involved in a lot of research over the years around pedagogy and how children learn and how this can be applied in schools. And there's no surprise that in appointing a head of research, the new or newish education inspection framework is very clearly grounded in that rhetoric around learning theory and how children learn. So I've picked out some of the key terms here about learners' needs, logical sequence to lessons and planning and curriculum, linking to prior learning, linking across topics, being aware of learners' progression and that effective use of assessment, using discussion and oracy to support learning, and embedding into that long-term memory and that kind of fluency of learning. So all of those things are part of that assessment inspection framework, and I think that's important to realise. So regardless of what you think about Ofsted, they are clearly looking at things that are informed by research evidence, which is quite a step change from before. The other thing in terms of your sort of direct context is your own teaching and learning policy. So that's, as you know, because you'll know it by heart, is rooted in the principles of instruction by Barak Rosenshine and that work that you've done around Sherrington's work on Rosenshine. It's also obviously rooted in the teaching standards. I've read your teaching and learning policy. It's 4 sides long. I really like it. Okay, so it does exactly what it says on the tin, and that is what you want from a really clear policy, particularly because again it's focused on that kind of pedagogy and learning theory. So what I want to do now is just go into a little bit more depth about how we learn. I'm hoping this is all revision for you, that you've seen this kind of stuff before, but it will serve as a useful reminder. So first of all, how do we know how we learn? Well, there are 2 kind of research fields that help us. One is neuroscience and one is cognitive psychology. Now, neuroscience, you'll know, is about how we kind of map the brain, how we look at what triggers different parts of the brain so that we can begin to identify which parts of the brain have which functions, or, which part of your physiological functions it controls. Cognitive psychology is an interpretive research field. So it's much harder to kind of have definitive scientific outcomes. But through this research field, we're beginning to understand how we think the brain works in terms of consciousness, cognitive processes, learning and empathy and things like that. And it's that field that probably has informed our understanding of learning more than anything else. It's still quite embryonic in a sense that there's still a lot more that we need to understand about how the brain works. But clearly there's some things that we can learn from that research field that can inform our practice. I just want to just show you just very quickly. I'm sure you've come across this before, but the diagram there in the middle, the blue and yellow diagram of the brain, I'm sure you've come across this before, but it's demarked between the old brain and the new brain. The old brain is our kind of primates, the bit of our brain that we've inherited from our primates. Again, it deals with those physiological functions of fear, fight, flight, control, whatever it may be. Interestingly, it's the part of the brain that kicks off when we have tantrums. I say when we have tantrums. Obviously, we don't anymore, but our children can have tantrums. It's that bit of the brain that's taking control. It's kind of that immediate response to sensory awareness around us. The part of the brain, the bigger part of the brain that's evolved around that, has been part of our kind of human evolution. And it's the part of the brain that adds kind of rational thought to the world around us, that kind of makes sense of the world around us. And it's the bit of the brain that we use to learn. It's that sort of cognitive part of the brain. So it's just useful to pick those two out there. We've all faced fearful situations. We can all be paralyzed by fear as well, and it's the old part of our brain that's talking to us to try and take control. If you read The Chimp Paradox by Professor Stephen Peters, for example, he talks about how he's trained athletes to take control over the kind of the old part of the brain, the chimp part of the brain, through rational thought to improve sporting success in competition. So let's just go through the basics of cognitive processes. So what I'm going to do now is just go through the three basics of cognitive processes. They are perception, attention, and memory. And we could do this in any order. It's quite difficult to work out the right order to talk about this, but we're going to deal with perception first of all. So perception is how we make sense of the world, and we use our senses to do that. So we kind of interact with the world around us through our sensory inputs. Now, what's important here from an educational perspective is how we process those inputs. Now, when you're a baby, your processing begins and ends with that sensory input. There's no prior learning or experience to apply any understanding to that sensory input. But what we're interested in is, as we get older, as children develop, they can begin to apply prior learning, prior experience to that sensory input. So what we need to be mindful of is that when we deliver anything, we'll talk about this again later on, but when we deliver anything new to our learners, we're trying to connect to prior learning in order for our learners to make sense of the new concepts and new ideas. And the key thing here is everybody has different starting points. And what I mean by that is that we can all understand concepts in a different way based on our prior learning and our prior experience. And that's really important to be aware of as a teacher. So the terms that you use, the language that you use, the ideas that you present may look completely different to different learners. So this is this idea of having concrete examples defining concepts and processes in a way where there are no ambiguities. So that's about perception. How about attention? Well, attention is how we kind of engage with the world, engage with teaching. Now, we all know what attention is. We'll have developed our kind of teacher radar to kind of know when people are paying attention. This is where I find it really hard to do this online work, and I'm sure you are teaching remotely as well, because we can't see the whites of the kids' eyes. We don't exactly know who's paying attention and who isn't. The interesting thing is that although we are quite in tune with it as teachers, particularly as we gain experience, it's a really, really hard thing to define and measure. It's quite hard to conduct experiments to work out exactly what attention is. But I think what's important is when we link attention to our working memory. So this is where we're going to begin to talk about memory as well. We have two types of memory, our working memory and our long-term memory. So we're just going to look at our working memory first. And this is this idea that we can only process a certain amount of information at any one time. Our attention or our working memory is a limited capacity resource. It doesn't matter whether we're an astronaut, a pilot, a surgeon, or a year 8 student. We have a very limited capacity in how much we can process at any one time. Multitasking is a bit of a myth, regardless of whether you think you're good at it or not. So what we have to be mindful of here is cognitive load, and I know you've done work on this before. Cognitive load is that mental effort required for a task over the mental resources available for the task. So a sort of simple formula. Perhaps a better way to consider this as is as sort of cup, let's say a cup of coffee, okay, probably because I could do with one right now. So if we consider our working memory as a limited resource, as a cup, there's three loads that can be placed on that working memory, and they are seen through the complexity of the information being received, the method of delivery, so how that's being communicated, and then the amount of kind of processing power that we've got left to understand what's happening. And the key thing is this, that if we increase the complexity of the information, or we increase the complexity of the kind of way that we're delivering that information to a learner, we're providing less space for learning. We're providing less kind of working memory to create that kind of understanding and then linking to a long-term memory. Now that's really important when we're thinking about teaching remotely, and I'm going to talk about pedagogical principles in remote delivery in a moment, but it's just to kind of link back to that emotional readiness for learning as well. What I've noticed is that some of our students are finding receiving kind of information online as adding another layer of complexity, which is reducing that capacity for understanding. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. I'll give you one simple example, just in terms of one diagram. Being a geographer, it's a water cycle, okay, hydrological cycle, and just very simply, the top diagram there has got the definitions separate from the diagram, and the bottom diagram has the definitions within the diagram. So the top one has an extra level in terms of being able to kind of decode the diagram if you're a learner, which is adding an extra layer of complexity to the method of delivery. So the top one is harder to understand for a learner than the bottom one. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce or remove all those barriers for learning. Okay, just lastly, in terms of learning theory, I just want to quickly talk about our long-term memory. Okay, so we've covered the working memory, but everything that we do is associated with our short and our long-term memory. So some key things about a long-term memory. Okay, some key messages. One is it's limitless. Okay, so it doesn't matter who we are, it doesn't matter where we're born, it doesn't matter what our socio-economic background is, we all have a limitless capacity to learn. We have a limitless long-term memory, and that's a really, really fundamental thing to remember. Some of our students will have barriers to learning, special educational needs that make our journey through learning harder, but each one of us has an unlimited capacity for learning, and that is an important thing to remember in terms of the potential of our learners in front of us. Learning takes place through making meaning, the schema. Okay, so we learn by making meaning of the information that's been provided through our working memory, and as I said before, we apply that to previous learning. And when we recall information, we reconstruct it. So when we recall meaning, we reconstruct it every single time. Our memory isn't like an analog library of information. We're not quite sure how it's kind of stored in memories in the brain, but what seems to happen is every time we recall something and we add some new understanding, we then kind of reconstruct that meaning each time. And as I said just a second ago, I got distracted by my other screen then. So every time we experience something new, we sort of apply that understanding to previous understanding. So I always think of it as kind of hanging a new concept onto a prior learning experience. And that has implications for you in terms of your teaching and your delivery and how you sequence your curriculum. Another key part of this that we seem to have found out through research is that making mistakes and forgetting is a really, really important part of the learning process. And so it's really important that we allow students to make mistakes in a non-threatening way, in a kind of low-risk way. Any of you botanists will know why I've got those particular flowers in that screen as well. A little bit of dual coding for you. Just again, just quite simply, when we're talking about memory, we're also talking about retaining memory, retention of memory. Ebbinghaus conducted a number of experiments where he created random words, nonsensical words, words that weren't originally part of the English language, and he looked at how much of that new information he could remember over a period of 7 days. And if you look at this diagram, you'll see that his ability to retain new information and information that couldn't be connected to prior learning, so they were words that weren't connected to anything within our normal language, was really, really poor. So he couldn't remember that new information over a period of 7 days. But what he also discovered was that if he regularly repeated his kind of recall over a distributed period of time, so he did this over a number of weeks, he could increase the amount of retention of those random words. So this obviously has implications for your delivery, your sequencing of your curriculum, which, as you know, is part of your teaching and learning policy. Okay, so we're going to move on to the very last piece of the presentation now, which is about effective strategies. And again, you're welcome to take a break. I'm going to just continue now just to look at effective pedagogical strategies. Okay, and I frame this very similarly to how Sherrington's framed this in his book around Rosenshine's principles, around these 6 pedagogical principles. Okay, so these are instruction, modeling, use of deliberate practice, feedback, questioning, and challenge. Okay, and when we talk about retrieval practice and linking to prior knowledge, that's all part of those pedagogical principles. Now, what's really important here is that I never want to give you a sort of message that you have to do each one of these in every lesson. Okay, this isn't about a kind of formulaic way of teaching, but what you want to do is make sure that you get each one of these things right when you do practice them in your lessons. Okay, so let's break down those pedagogical principles into sort of 3 sections. The first is about how we plan for learning. The second is how we develop understanding. And the third is about reinforcing learning. So firstly, when we're planning for learning, we're interested in spaced practice, as I described just now, revisiting prior concepts and prior learning. Then we use our teaching skills to develop understanding. So it could be through our use of elaboration or explanation. It could be through our concrete examples or dual coding. It could be how we model or how we use deliberate practice. So those are about how we develop understanding with our learners. And lastly, it's about how we reinforce learning. So whether we use oracy and talk in the class, how we pitch our lessons and ensure we've got high challenge, how we ensure that there's independent practice taking place, and how we use feedback are all important strategies to reinforce learning. So I think we've got, though it's difficult, I think we've got a number of opportunities here in terms of teaching remotely and then considering how we teach the students come back. And I just want to go through a couple of those now. I think it's really important to remember that we need to keep our instruction and explanation very, very clear and very, very precise at the minute, particularly when we're teaching remotely. And I'm going to talk about why that's important in a second. It's very important that we don't overload learners through our delivery, just thinking about that cognitive load. So perhaps think about how we chunk information and chunk instruction. I think we've got a huge opportunity in terms of modelling at the minute, using video clips, using narratives, maybe using visualizers again to pick out really good examples of students' work. That can all be done remotely at the minute, as well as when students come back into school. Feedback is crucial, and I'm going to pick up on that explicitly in a minute, but just considering about purpose and pitch of feedback is absolutely crucial at the minute. And it's about challenge, so ensuring that we're considering learners' needs. We've got high challenge, but we're scaffolding back to ensure that all learners can reach what our intended outcomes should be. I just want to take you back to that polyvagal chart, because one of the things that I've noticed again over the last 12 months, and I made reference to this earlier, is that our learners, because of the current situation, because of the pandemic, are perhaps even more emotionally charged than they would be normally. And it's not taking much to trigger that kind of, particularly that yellow response, that kind of charged response. And it could be something as simple as poor instruction. It could be something as simple as some IT not working, or the Wi-Fi not working, or a complete mismatch and challenge, and work not being engaging. It could be a sort of cognitive overload during a long day of Zoom lessons, for example. Whatever it is, we've got to be really, really mindful not to trigger a defensive response with our learners, that we try and ensure that as we're delivering remotely, we're kind of in tune as much as we can be with learners' needs. Whether that's about giving some time away from the screen, setting an activity that takes place outside so children are getting a bit of fresh air and a stretch of the legs, not having an hour of, I don't know, complex maths formula on a Friday afternoon on a Zoom call after a week of Zoom calls. I think it's all really, really important to be mindful of at the minute. So I said I'd talk to you about feedback just quickly. I think feedback's really important. We know it's effective in improving student outcomes when it's delivered effectively. It can be counterproductive when feedback is overly full of praise and not very accurate in terms of identifying learners' needs. Now, last year, when we first had remote learning, it was much harder to deliver feedback when we weren't delivering live lessons, but it was possible. I think it adds to a sense of kind of social and personal connectivity with the teacher and the learner, so it supports those kind of relationships and rapport. It encourages engagement and motivation, and there's some really interesting research around linking feedback with retrieval practice in increasing the motivation of our learners, particularly through remote delivery. It obviously can help learners identify where effort and learning needs to focus, which supports that metacognition as well. But the key thing to remember for you is not to think about how you give feedback, but how feedback is received. So think about the recipient and what's going to be most useful in terms of how that feedback is received. Okay, so just in summary, a couple of key points from the presentation this morning for you to think about. Know your student starting point. So I know that one of the things that you're going to be doing is looking at where you think your student starting points might be as they come back into school, hopefully over the next few weeks and a few months. So where the gaps are in learning and where there's been success, and how you kind of address that for your learners. Learning won't take place without a sense of safety and trust, and that's going to be really, really important again as students come back into school. How you communicate, how zoning is going to take place, for example, what lessons are going to look like. That communication needs to be really, really clear, as well as how you develop that with your students individually. Very simply, learning is a change in our long-term memory, and our long-term memory is limitless. We've got that huge capacity to learn. And all of the things that you do in terms of those pedagogical principles, you need to do them really, really well to support the learning taking place. It's really, really important at the minute. Okay. Retrieval practice and feedback increases motivation to study. So there's some really good research behind that, as I've just mentioned. And I think there's real opportunity to revisit prior learning at the minute to do that retrieval practice, that spaced learning, as we're delivering online and as students come back in to kind of assess where they are. So hopefully that's been useful for you. With these slides, I'll send out the links to further information that I referred to the Nordic schools, to the podcast if you're interested. It'd be great if you are on Twitter, just get in touch with me on @JimRogers72. It'd be great to hear from you. Otherwise, I wish you all the best of luck. Have a lovely half term. And I'm looking forward to working with the RQTs especially over the next few months. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.